The transport shuttle docked with a low metallic groan that shook through the walls and rattled the overhead compartments, and made the little girl in seat 14 grip the armrest just a tiny bit harder. Mara Chen was 8 years old, and she had messy black hair tied into 2 uneven ponytails, and a gap where her left front tooth used to be, and a backpack covered in stickers of cartoon animals that she had collected from every spaceport between Earth and the Outer Ring. She was not special by any galactic standard. She was small, even for a human child, and quiet in the way that made adults forget she was in the room. And she had the kind of wide brown eyes that always seemed to be watching everything without saying a word about any of it. But the thing sitting in the carrier next to her feet was a different story entirely. Sergeant Biscuit was a honey badger. She weighed about 12 kilograms and had coarse silver-black fur and a wide white stripe running from her forehead down to the base of her thick neck, and she had claws that could dig through sun-baked earth, and teeth that could crack a tortoise shell, and a personality that could best be described as pure and absolute fury, packed into the body of something barely larger than a house cat. Right now she was asleep, and snoring with one paw twitching against the mesh wall of the carrier, and she looked almost peaceful if you did not know any better. Commander David Chen stood up from his seat across the aisle, and stretched his back, and looked down at his daughter with the kind of tired smile that fathers wear when they have been traveling for 11 days straight through 4 relay gates and 2 customs checkpoints. "Ready, kiddo?" he asked. Mara nodded, and reached down and unlatched the top of the carrier, and Sergeant Biscuit woke up immediately with a short, sharp huff, and climbed out onto the seat and sat there, looking around the cabin with her small dark eyes, like she was deciding whether or not anything in here was worth fighting. Nothing was. Not yet, anyway. David clipped the reinforced leash onto the harness around the honey badger's thick body and handed the end of it to Mara, who wrapped it twice around her wrist, the way she always did. They walked off the shuttle together into the docking corridor of Station Velith 9. The station was enormous. It was one of the largest waystation hubs in Lorathi-controlled space, and it hung in the void between 2 dead stars, like a city turned inside out, with its lights and noise and movement all contained within a spinning shell of dark metal and pale blue glass. Thousands of species passed through Velith 9 every cycle. Tall, spindly Lorathi technicians clicked along the corridors on their segmented legs, with their compound eyes reflecting the overhead lights in fractured patterns of gold and green. Short, heavy Brun traders waddled past in groups of 4, carrying crates of crystallized fuel cells, and arguing loudly in a language that sounded like gravel being chewed. Wispy Alith diplomats floated by without touching the ground, their translucent bodies shimmering like soap bubbles filled with light. And then there was Mara, a small human girl walking calmly through the middle of all of it, with a honey badger trotting beside her on a leash. Nobody looked twice at her. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic stage, and they were not impressive by any physical measure, and most species considered them to be soft and slow and strangely emotional, and not particularly dangerous in any meaningful way. The honey badger received even less attention. A Lorathi security officer at the first checkpoint glanced down at Sergeant Biscuit and tapped something into his datapad, and the entry read, "One companion animal, subclass negligible, no threat classification required." Without a second thought, David led Mara through the wide, curving hallways of the station toward the diplomatic quarter, where he would be spending the next several weeks negotiating humanity's first major trade corridor with the Lorathi Concord. It was an important assignment. Earth needed access to Lorathi medical technology, especially their nerve repair biofilms, which could heal spinal injuries that human medicine still could not touch. The Lorathi wanted access to human agricultural genetics, because somehow in the entire galaxy, No other species had ever figured out how to grow food as efficiently as humans did. It should have been a simple deal. Both sides had something the other wanted, and the math made sense, and the diplomats had been exchanging polite messages for months leading up to this. But nothing in galactic politics was ever simple, and David knew that, and he had told Mara before they left Earth that she needed to be on her best behavior. Because there were people on this station who did not want this deal to happen, and they would be looking for any excuse to shut it down. Mara had nodded seriously and then looked at Sergeant Biscuit and said, "You too." The honey badger had sneezed. Now, as they approached the entrance to the Concorde's processing wing, David felt the atmosphere shift. The hallways became quieter, and the lighting changed from warm yellow to a cold, sterile blue. The walls were lined with scanning equipment and monitoring panels, and everything had the sharp, clean smell of something that had been sanitized recently and thoroughly. A tall Larathi official stood at the processing gate with 4 compound eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on a smooth, angular face, and long, segmented arms folded behind a narrow back. "Commander Chen," the official said, in precise translated English that came from a small device clipped to what might have been a collar or might have been part of the uniform. Creature's exoskeleton. Welcome to the Concorde Processing Center. All visitors are required to undergo a standard bioscan before entering the diplomatic quarter. This is non-negotiable. David nodded and said, "Of course, we were briefed on the procedure." The official's eyes shifted down to Mara, and then further down to Sergeant Biscuit, who was sitting on the cold floor and scratching behind her own ear with a back foot. "The animal," the official said. "She stays with my daughter," David said, and his voice was calm, but there was no room in it for discussion. The official paused and then looked at the datapad, and then at the honey badger again, and apparently decided that a 12-kilogram creature with a negligible threat classification was not worth arguing about. "Very well," the official said, and stepped aside and gestured them through the gate. Mara walked forward holding the leash, and Sergeant Biscuit trotted beside her, and as they passed through the gate, the honey badger lifted her nose and sniffed the air once and then twice, and her ears flattened just slightly. Mara noticed. She always noticed. She leaned down without breaking stride and whispered very quietly, so that only the honey badger could hear, "Be good." Sergeant Biscuit yawned, and every single one of her teeth caught the cold blue light and gleamed. The processing center was a long oval room with smooth pale walls that curved upward into a ceiling covered in soft blue light panels. And the floor was made of something that looked like glass, but felt solid and cold under Mara's shoes. And the whole place hummed with a low vibration that she could feel in her chest, like standing too close to a big speaker. There were 6 scanning stations, arranged in a row along the far wall, each one staffed by a Larathi technician wearing a dark fitted uniform that wrapped around their segmented bodies like a second skin. Each station had a tall, thin device mounted on a mechanical arm that could extend and rotate, and the device looked like a long rod made of something between glass and bone, and it glowed faintly from the inside with a pale green bioluminescent light that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. Commander David Chen went first. He stepped onto the scanning platform, which was just a raised circle on the floor, about 2 meters wide, and he stood still, with his arms slightly out from his sides, the way the technician instructed, and the scanning rod extended from the wall and swept slowly around him from head to toe. It took about 40 seconds. The rod hummed, and the light inside it flickered, and then a series of symbols appeared on a display panel next to the technician, and the technician studied them, and then tapped something, and nodded. "Clear," the technician said, in flat translated English. "No pathogens, no prohibited implants, no anomalous biological signatures. You may proceed." David stepped off the platform and looked back at Mara, and gave her a small, encouraging nod. Mara took a breath and walked forward. Sergeant Biscuit walked with her. The honey badger's claws clicked on the glass-like floor with each step, and her head was low, and her body was relaxed, but her eyes were open and moving and tracking every single thing in the room, the way they always. A second technician stepped forward to handle Mara's scan, and this one was taller than the first, with longer arms and a narrower head, and compound eyes that were a darker shade of gold, and it moved with the quick, efficient confidence of someone who had done this procedure 10,000 times and had never once found it interesting. The technician looked down at Mara, and then at the honey badger, and its mandibles clicked once, which Mara had learned was the Larathi equivalent of a dismissive shrug. "Step onto the platform," the technician said. Mara stepped up, and Sergeant Biscuit stepped up with her, and sat down right next to Mara's left foot, and the leash hung loose between them. The technician did not ask Mara to remove the animal, because the animal was classified as negligible, and removing negligible things was not part of the procedure. The scanning arm began to extend from the wall. The rod unfolded segment by segment, like a telescoping antenna made of living crystal, and it hummed as it came closer, and the bioluminescent light inside it shifted from pale green to a brighter, more intense shade of blue-white. Mara watched it come toward her, and she held very still. Sergeant Biscuit did not hold still. The honey badger's entire body changed in a way that was so subtle and so fast that no one in the room caught it. Her muscles tightened under her loose skin, and her weight shifted forward onto her front paws, and her claws dug into the surface of the platform, just slightly, and her eyes locked onto the tip of the scanning rod with a focus that was absolute and total and completely without fear. She did not growl. She did not hiss. She just watched. The rod came closer, and the hum grew louder and higher in pitch, and then it was right in front of Mara's face, about 20 centimeters from her nose. And the technician pressed a control on the wall panel, and the scanner activated. Sent out a pulse. The pulse was invisible, but Mara felt it immediately, like a wave of cold pressure that pushed through her skin and into her muscles, and it made her teeth ache and her eyes water, and she flinched. It was not a small flinch. It was the kind of flinch that a child makes when something hurts unexpectedly, and her whole body jerked backward just a few centimeters, and she made a tiny sound in her throat that was not quite a cry, but was close. David saw it from across the room, and he took a step forward, and his face changed. But he was not fast enough. Nobody was fast enough. Sergeant Biscuit moved. The honey badger exploded off the platform surface, with a speed that should not have been possible for an animal her size, and she launched herself upward and forward with her jaws open and her teeth bared, and she hit the scanning rod like a furry 12-kilogram missile. Her jaws clamped down on the rod about halfway along its length, and the sound that followed was extraordinary. It was a crunch. Not the crunch of something fragile breaking, but the crunch of something that was supposed to be strong, and was supposed to be durable, and was supposed to withstand the wear and tear of thousands of scans, being absolutely and completely destroyed by something that simply did not care how strong it was supposed to be. The rod snapped in half. The top half went spinning across the room, trailing sparks and fragments of bioluminescent crystal, and it hit the far wall with a crack and fell to the floor in pieces. The bottom half stayed attached to the mechanical arm, but it was shattered and dark, and smoking slightly, and leaking a thin fluid that might have been coolant or might have been something else entirely. Sergeant Biscuit landed back on the platform, with the middle section of the rod still in her mouth, and she bit down once more, and it crumbled like chalk, and she spat out the pieces, stood over the debris with her fur bristled, and her lips pulled back, and a sound coming from her chest that was not quite a growl, but was more like a warning from something ancient and primal, and completely unwilling to negotiate. The technician had stumbled backward and was pressing itself against the wall with its segmented arms raised, and a thin line of pale ichor running from a shallow scratch on one of its lower limbs, where a fragment of the rod had grazed it. The room was silent. Every single Lorathi in the processing center had frozen in place, and their compound eyes were all pointed at the same thing, which was the small, scarred animal standing on the platform, surrounded by the broken remains of a very expensive piece of equipment. Mara was still standing on the platform. She had not moved. She looked down at Sergeant Biscuit, and the honey badger looked up at her, and huffed once through her nose. Mara blinked. Then she said in a perfectly poised, calm voice that carried across the entire silent room, "I told you to be good." Sergeant Biscuit sat down and licked one of her paws. From across the room, David Chen closed his eyes and let out a very long, very slow breath through his nose, and thought about how this was going to look in his diplomatic report. It was going to look terrible. But somewhere underneath the dread, a small part of him was thinking something else entirely. Something like pride. It took less than 10 minutes for the situation to go from bad to much worse. 4 Lorathi security officers arrived at the processing center in full tactical gear, which for a Lorathi meant lightweight exoskeletal armor plating over their upper segments, and short-range pulse weapons holstered along their lower limbs and visors over their compound eyes that flickered with targeting data. They moved in a tight formation through the doorway and spread out across the room, and 2 of them took positions near the exits, and the other 2 approached the scanning platform, where Mara was still standing, with Sergeant Biscuit sitting at her feet, looking bored. David stepped between his daughter and the security officers immediately, and held up both hands palms out in the universal gesture of "let us all calm down before somebody does something stupid." "Commander Chen," a voice said from behind the security line. The tall Lorathi official from the gate walked into the room with a second figure beside him, and this second figure was different from the others in the room. This one wore a deep blue sash across its torso, which Mara's father recognized as the mark of a Concord adjudicator, which was basically a combination of judge and prosecutor, and someone you absolutely did not want to be standing in front of if you were already having a bad day. The adjudicator's name was Thesic, and its voice was cold and precise, and it wasted no time. "Your animal has destroyed Concord property," Thesic said. "It has drawn the blood of a Concord technician. It has disrupted a mandatory security procedure, and it has created what I can only describe as an unprecedented breach of station protocol." David kept his hands visible and his voice steady. "Adjudicator Thesic, I understand this looks serious, and I want to assure you that we will cooperate fully with any investigation. But I need you to understand that the animal acted in defense of my daughter." "Defense," Thesic repeated, and its mandibles clicked in what was clearly not amusement. "Defense against a standard bioscan that every visitor to this station undergoes without incident? That is your explanation, Commander." "The scan hurt her," David said. "My daughter flinched in pain. The animal responded to a perceived threat against its bonded companion. That is what these animals do." Thesic's compound eyes shifted to Sergeant Biscuit, who was now lying on her side on the platform with her eyes half closed, as if the most exciting part of her day was already over. "Regardless of the animal's motivation," Thesic said, "the Concord's position is clear. The creature must be confiscated and euthanized in accordance with Station Regulation 714 regarding dangerous fauna, and your delegation's access to the diplomatic quarter is suspended pending a full review." David felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he did not let it reach his heart. "Face. I cannot allow that," he said. "You do not have the authority to disallow it, Commander." "Actually," David said, and he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data pad and tapped it twice, and held it up so that Thesic could see the screen. "I do. On the screen was a document. It was titled the Terran Companion Animal Accords, and it was a legal framework that had been ratified by the United Earth Council 6 years ago, and it was one of the strangest pieces of legislation that any species in the galaxy had ever encountered. The Accords established that certain animals bonded to human beings were not property. They were not pets. They were not livestock, or tools, or accessories. They were legally recognized as bonded guardian companions, and under human law, they held a status that was somewhere between a family member and a bodyguard, and harming one was treated with the same severity as harming the human they were bonded to. Other species in the known galaxy had anything like it. The Lorathi did not keep animals at all, and the idea of forming an emotional or legal bond with a non-sentient creature was so alien to them that Thesic spent a full minute reading the document in silence, with all 4 of its eyes moving independently across the text. "This is absurd," Thesic said finally. "It is human law," David said, "and under the terms of the diplomatic framework that your own Concord agreed to when you invited us here. Both parties are required to respect each other's domestic legal protections. That animal is bonded to my daughter, and under our law, she has the same right to protection as any member of my family." Thesic's mandibles worked silently for a moment. Then the adjudicator turned to one of the security officers and spoke rapidly in Lorathi, and the officer responded. And then there was a brief exchange that David could not follow, because his translation device was struggling with the speed and the technical vocabulary. While this was happening, Mara sat down on the edge of the platform and pulled Sergeant Biscuit into her lap, and the honey badger settled there with a grunt, and Mara stroked the rough fur along her back. She was scared. She did not show it, because her father had taught her that showing fear in front of aliens who did not understand human facial expressions was pointless. And because Sergeant Biscuit could always tell when she was scared anyway, and the honey badger being calm in her lap was doing more to steady her nerves than anything else in the room. On the other side of the processing center, something else was happening. 2 Lorathi technicians had gathered the broken pieces of the scanning rod and had taken them to a diagnostic table, and they were running an analysis on the fragments and whispering to each other in quick clicking bursts. One of them pulled up a display screen and stared at it, and then pulled it closer and stared harder. Then that technician turned and looked at the other technician and said something that made the second technician go very still. The first technician stood up and walked quickly across the room to where Thesic was still arguing with Commander Chen, and it interrupted the adjudicator mid-sentence, which was apparently a very serious breach of etiquette, because Thesic turned on the technician with visible irritation. But the technician held up the display screen, and Thesic looked at it. And Thesic stopped talking. The room got quiet again. "What is it?" David asked. Thesic did not answer immediately. The adjudicator read the screen once, and then twice, and then looked up at the technician and said something short and sharp in Lorathi, and the technician nodded. Thesic turned back to David, and when it spoke again, the cold precision in its voice had been replaced by something else, almost like concern. "Commander Chen," Thesic said, "it appears that the scanning device that was used on your daughter was not set to the standard civilian bioscan frequency." David felt the cold thing in his stomach turn into something sharper. "What was it set to?" he asked. "It was calibrated to a deep-tissue military-grade scanning frequency," Thesic said, "a setting that is used for interrogation-level biological analysis of adult subjects. It is not authorized for civilian use, and it is certainly not authorized for use on a child." The room shifted. Every security officer in the room turned to look at the broken scanner, and then at the technician who had operated it. And that technician was backing slowly toward the wall, with its segmented arms pressed flat against its sides. "If that scan had completed its full cycle on a child of your daughter's size and age," Thesic continued, and its voice was very careful now, It could have caused significant damage to her peripheral nervous system, potentially permanent. David looked at Mara. Mara looked at Sergeant Biscuit. Sergeant Biscuit was asleep in her lap, with one ear twitching. The question in the room was no longer why the animal had attacked. The question was why the scanner had been set to hurt a child in the first place. The investigation began within the hour. Thesic had called in a Concord Internal Affairs Unit, which was a small team of Lorathi investigators who answered directly to the Concord's governing council, and who had the authority to detain and question any station personnel, regardless of rank or department. The lead investigator was a Lorathi named Kivrith. Kivrith was shorter than most Lorathi, and had a slightly crooked set of mandibles that gave the impression of a permanent frown, and compound eyes that were an unusual shade of amber instead of the typical gold. There was something about the way Kivrith moved through a room that suggested this was someone who noticed things that other people worked very hard to keep hidden. Kivrith had been assigned to investigate the scanner miscalibration, and within the first 30 minutes of the investigation, two things became very clear. The first was that the scanner had not malfunctioned. Settings on Lorathi's scanning equipment were protected by multiple layers of security encryption, and changing them required both a physical access key and a 6-digit authorization code that was unique to each technician. And the log showed that the scanner had been deliberately recalibrated from civilian mode to military-grade interrogation mode, exactly 14 minutes before Mara Chen stepped onto the platform. The second thing that became clear was that the technician who had operated the scanner was terrified. Not terrified of the investigation, terrified of something else. Kivrith sat across from the technician in a small gray interview room and watched the creature's segmented arms tremble, and its compound eyes dart toward the door every few seconds. And Kivrith recognized the body language immediately. This was someone who had been told to do something by someone more powerful, and who was now realizing that the powerful someone was not going to protect them from the consequences. It took less than 20 minutes for the technician to break. The technician had been approached 3 days earlier by a senior member of the Concord's Trade Commission named Vothal, who was one of the highest-ranking officials on the station, and who had been publicly vocal about opposing the trade agreement with humanity. Vothal had told the technician to recalibrate the scanner. Vothal had told the technician that the scan would cause enough discomfort to make the human child cry, and that the father would react with aggression, as humans were known to do, and that this aggression would be recorded and used as evidence that humans were too volatile and too dangerous to be trusted with a trade partnership. It was supposed to be a provocation, a small injury to a child designed to trigger a predictable emotional response from the father, which would then be used to justify ending the negotiations before they even began. Was calculated, and it was cruel, and it would have worked, except nobody had planned for Sergeant Biscuit. Kivrith filed the technician's confession and then sat alone in the interview room for a long time, thinking. Then Kivrith did something unusual for a Lorathi investigator. Kivrith opened the Galactic Species database and searched for honey badger. The entry was short. It read, Mellivora capensis, Terran mammalian species, subclass negligible, no significant threat profile, commonly kept as a companion animal by humans in certain cultural contexts. Kivrith read this, and then pulled up the footage from the processing center and watched the honey badger destroy the scanning rod. And Kivrith watched it 3 times, and then a 4th time in slow motion. Then Kivrith went to find Commander Chen. David was in a temporary quarters unit on the station's lower level, with Mara asleep on a cot and Sergeant Biscuit curled up at her feet. Kivrith knocked. David opened the door with the expression of a man who had not slept and was not planning to sleep any time soon. Investigator, David said. Commander, Kivrith said, I need to ask you about the animal. David glanced back at Sergeant Biscuit and then stepped out into the hallway and closed the door halfway. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," Kivrith said. And so David told Kivrith about honey badgers. He told Kivrith that they were native to Africa and parts of Asia, and that they had been documented fighting off lions and leopards and hyenas and packs of wild dogs, and winning. He told Kivrith that their skin was so thick and so loose that if something grabbed them by the back of the neck, they could literally turn around inside their own skin and bite whatever was holding them. He told Kivrith that they were nearly immune to the venom of cobras and black mambas, and that they had been observed being bitten by some of the deadliest snakes on Earth, and simply falling asleep for a few hours, and then waking up and eating the snake. He told Kivrith that they could dig through concrete and break into reinforced enclosures and open latches and solve problems with a level of intelligence that made scientists uncomfortable. He told Kivrith that they were completely and absolutely fearless in a way that was not bravery, because bravery implied the presence of fear being overcome, and honey badgers simply did not seem to experience fear at all. Kivrith listened to all of this in silence. Then Kivrith said, "And you give these to your children?" David smiled for the first time in hours. "Sergeant Biscuit was born 3 weeks after Mara," he said. "They have been together since Mara was old enough to crawl. The badger sleeps in her room and walks with her to school and goes everywhere she goes. And there is nothing in this universe or any other that will hurt that little girl while that animal is alive." Kivrith was quiet for a moment. Then Kivrith went back to the database terminal and filed a reclassification request. 12 hours later, the Galactic Species database was updated. Mellivora capensis was reclassified from Class 0 Negligible to Class 7 Extreme Threat, with a special notation that read, "Do not engage under any circumstances." For reference, a Krathian warhound, which was a genetically modified predator bred specifically for combat, and which stood 2 meters tall at the shoulder and had armored scales and venomous fangs, was classified as Class 5. The honey badger was now officially rated as more dangerous than a purpose-built alien war beast. Word spread across the station fast. Within a day, every species on Velith 9 had seen the footage from the processing center and had read the updated classification and had done the math. And the math was terrifying. Alien visitors began crossing to the other side of corridors when they saw Mara coming. A group of Brun traders who had been drinking in a station bar watched the footage on a screen above the counter, and one of them turned to the others and said, "The humans brought a Class 7 predator onto this station, and they gave it to a child, and the child put it on a leash and told it to be good." And nobody at that bar said anything for a long time after that. Meanwhile, Mara walked through the station, with Sergeant Biscuit trotting beside her on the leash, and she noticed that people were moving out of her way, and she did not understand why, because Sergeant Biscuit was being very well behaved. The honey badger was asleep on Mara's lap in the quarters, when Kivrith came back to deliver the news about Vothal's arrest. Sergeant Biscuit opened one eye and looked at Kivrith, and then closed it again. Kivrith decided not to sit down. The arrest of Vothal sent a shockwave through the Concord that was felt far beyond Station Velith 9. Vothal had been a senior member of the Trade Commission and a respected voice in the isolationist faction of the Larathi government. And when the evidence of the conspiracy was presented to the governing council, there was no room for denial or deflection. The scanner logs were clear. The technician's testimony was recorded, and the footage of a 12-kilogram Earth predator shearing through military-grade Larathi alloy with its jaws was being watched on every station, outpost, and colony world in the sector on a loop. Vothal was stripped of rank and title and remanded to a detention facility on the Larathi homeworld to await formal proceedings. And 7 other officials who had been connected to the plot were suspended pending investigation. And the entire isolationist faction suddenly found itself with a lot fewer allies than it had the day before. Because the thing about conspiracies is that they only work when they stay hidden, and this one had been blown wide open by an animal that weighed less than a medium-sized piece of luggage. The trade negotiations resumed 4 days after the incident. But they were different now. The Lorathi delegation that sat across from Commander David Chen in the long, curved conference room on the diplomatic quarters upper level was not the same delegation that had greeted him when he arrived. These Lorathi were more careful, more polite, more willing to listen, and every single one of them glanced at the open doorway at least once during the proceedings, because they knew that somewhere on the other side of that doorway, a little girl was doing her homework in a waiting room with a Class 7 predator sleeping on her feet. The negotiations moved quickly. The Lorathi agreed to provide full access to their nerve repair biofilm technology, including manufacturing specifications and training for human medical teams. And in exchange, humanity agreed to share its agricultural genetic libraries, including drought-resistant grain strains and high-yield root vegetable cultivars, and a dozen other innovations that the rest of the galaxy found baffling because no other species had ever invested so much effort into making food grow in places where food was not supposed to grow. It was a good deal. It was a fair deal. And it was done in half the time that anyone had expected, because it turned out that negotiations went a lot faster when one side had recently been reminded that the other side was not to be underestimated. On the last evening before the Chen family was scheduled to depart Velith 9, Kivrith came to their quarters. The investigator had become something like a friend over the past weeks, which was unusual for a Lorathi, because the Lorathi were not a species that made friends easily or quickly. Something about David Chen's quiet steadiness and Mara's wide-eyed curiosity, and even the honey badger's absolute refusal to care about anything, that had worn down the investigator's professional detachment. Mara was sitting on the floor of the quarters with her back against the cot, and Sergeant Biscuit was lying across her legs, and Mara was reading something on a small tablet, and the honey badger was making a low rumbling sound that was not quite a purr, but was close enough. Kivrith stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. "Commander," Kivrith said, "I have a question that has been bothering me since the beginning of this, and I have not been able to find the answer in any database." David was packing a bag on the other side of the room, and he looked up and said, "Go ahead." "Why?" Kivrith said. David waited. "You are not a physically dominant species," Kivrith said, and the words were not meant as an insult, and David did not take them as one. "You are not the fastest or the strongest or the most resilient, and your senses are average at best, and your natural weapons are essentially non-existent." "That is all true," David said, "and yet you take some of the most dangerous predators on your world, and you bond with them, and you make them part of your families, and you give them to your children." Kivrith said, "I have spent the past 3 weeks researching this, and I have found records of humans bonding with wolves and big cats, and birds of prey, and venomous reptiles, and I do not understand why. What is the evolutionary advantage of forming emotional bonds with things that can kill you?" David thought about this for a moment. Then he looked at Mara and Sergeant Biscuit on the floor. "Kivrith," he said, "do you know what the most dangerous environment on Earth is?" "I do not." "All of them," David said. "Every single one. Our planet is covered in things that want to eat us, and things that can poison us, and things that can crush us, and weather that can kill us. And we are exactly as soft and slow as you described. And for most of our history, the only advantage we had was that we were very good at making friends." He zipped the bag closed. "We looked at the wolves that hunted us, and we said, what if they hunted with us instead? And we looked at the wildcats that stalked our camps, and we said, what if they guarded our grain instead? And we looked at the horses that could outrun us, and we said, what if they carried us instead?" He sat down on the edge of the cot. "We survived because we figured out that you do not have to be the most dangerous thing in the world if the most dangerous thing in the world is on your side." Kivrith looked at Sergeant Biscuit. The honey badger opened one eye and looked back at Kivrith. and there was something in that small dark eye that was ancient and fierce and completely unimpressed by everything in the universe that was not. Mara adds, "And the children," Kivrith asked quietly. "Especially the children," David said, "because the thing about a bond like that is that it goes both ways." Mara did not choose Sergeant Biscuit, and Sergeant Biscuit did not choose Mara, but they grew up together, and they are part of each other now, and there is no force in this galaxy that will separate them. Mara looked up from her tablet, and at Kivrith, and she smiled the gap-toothed smile of an 8-year-old who did not fully understand why everyone on this station was suddenly so interested in her pet. "She is not dangerous," Mara said, and she scratched Sergeant Biscuit behind the ears, and the honey badger made the rumbling sound again. "She is mine. There is a difference." Kivrith considered this, and then for the first time in the investigation and possibly for the first time in a very long career, Kivrith made a sound that the translation device interpreted as a laugh. The Chens departed Velith 9 the next morning on an outbound transport, and Mara sat in her seat with Sergeant Biscuit in the carrier beside her feet, and the honey badger was asleep before the shuttle even cleared the docking clamps. The story did not end there. 3 days after their departure, a Lorathi newsfeed program that was broadcast across 17 star systems ran a segment about the incident on Velith 9. The anchor was a veteran Lorathi journalist with a calm, measured voice, and the segment included the footage from the processing center and excerpts from Kivrith's report, and a brief interview with a xenobiologist who had spent years studying Earth fauna. At the end of the segment, the anchor looked directly into the broadcast lens and delivered a statement that would be quoted and rebroadcast and translated into more than 400 alien languages over the following months. The statement was simple. It was a recommendation directed at every species in the known galaxy. Said this: "If you encounter humans, do not be alarmed by their soft bodies, or their strange emotions, or their tendency to smile at things that should frighten them. But if you see a human child, do not approach too quickly, and do not make sudden movements. And above all, do not under any circumstances do anything that might be interpreted as a threat, because it is not the human you should be afraid of. It is whatever the human has brought with them." The segment cut to a still image from the processing center footage. It showed Mara standing on the scanning platform with her hands at her sides, and her face calm, and her eyes wide and clear. And at her feet, standing over the broken remains of a shattered scanner, with her fur bristled and her teeth bared, and absolutely no fear anywhere in her 12-kilogram body, was Sergeant Biscuit. The image became the most shared file on the Galactic Network for 6 consecutive cycles. Somewhere on a transport shuttle. Halfway to Earth, Mara Chen was asleep with her head against the window, and her hand resting on the carrier beside her. And inside the carrier, Sergeant Biscuit was also asleep, with one paw pressed against the mesh, right where Mara's fingers were. They dreamed their separate dreams, but they were together. And that was the point. That had always been the point.